"I bet I can make you tap out," she said to her married boss, leaving him shocked. Smash that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because trust me, you are going to want to see how this one plays out. Penelope Johnson had never walked into a room quietly a day in her life. Not because she was loud, no, Penelope was far too calculated for that. It was something else entirely. The way she moved, slow and deliberate, like she had already decided how every conversation in that room was going to end before it even began. The kind of woman that made other women straighten their posture and made men forget what they were about to say. She had been at Harlow and Associates for 2 years, smart enough to climb, savvy enough to know exactly how far she could push before anyone could say a word about it. Her work was impeccable, no one could touch her on that. But it was everything that existed just outside of her work that made people talk in hushed tones near the coffee machine. And then there was Mr. Cole. Richard Cole, managing director, married 7 years to a woman named Diane who attended every company function on his arm looking every bit the picture of a life well built. He was the kind of man who commanded a room without raising his voice. Broad shoulders, tailored suits, the sort of jaw that looked like it had never carried an ounce of doubt in its life. He didn't flirt. He didn't linger. He kept every interaction crisp, professional, and precisely within bounds. Which is exactly what made him interesting to Penelope. She had watched him for months. Not obviously, Penelope never did anything obviously, but she had clocked every pattern. The way he took his coffee black, no conversation before 9 a.m. The way he loosened his tie exactly once, always around 6 p.m. when he thought the floor had emptied. The way his eyes would catch hers in a meeting for just a fraction of a second longer than they needed to, and then snap away like he'd touched something hot. He felt it, she was certain of that. He just believed he was stronger than it. And that quiet, iron confidence of his was the most irresistible thing about him. Penelope wasn't reckless. She wasn't the type to blow up her career over a feeling. But she also had never in her life walked away from a challenge. And Richard Cole, with his wedding ring and his composure and his carefully constructed walls, was the most interesting challenge she had ever encountered. She hadn't made a move yet. She was still watching, still measuring, still deciding exactly where to place the first stone. But the decision had already been made. She just hadn't told him yet. Monday morning arrived the way it always did at Harlow and Associates, with the low hum of ambition and the smell of expensive coffee. The open-plan floor was already buzzing by 8:45 a.m., keyboards clicking, phones ringing, the usual performance of productivity that everyone put on before the real day actually began. Penelope arrived at 8:47, not early enough to seem eager, not late enough to be noticed for the wrong reasons. She had curated even that, the precise timing of her entrance. She set her bag down at her desk, smoothed the front of her fitted charcoal dress, and let her eyes do one slow sweep of the floor the way they did every morning. His office light was already on. It was always already on. She had once asked his assistant, Brenda, what time Mr. Cole usually came in. Brenda had laughed and said, "Honestly, I think he sleeps here." Penelope had smiled politely and filed that information away like everything else she collected about him, quietly, carefully, without anyone noticing she was even asking. She poured her coffee, exchanged pleasantries with her colleague Darius, who sat 2 desks over and talked too much about football, and settled in. To anyone watching, she was the picture of a focused, driven professional starting her week. And she was. That was the thing about Penelope that people consistently underestimated. She was genuinely excellent at her job. The ambition was real. The intelligence was real. Whatever game she was quietly playing on the side existed completely separately from the quality of her work, and she never allowed one to bleed into the other. At least not yet. The first meeting of the week was a department-wide briefing at 10 a.m. 12 people around a long glass table, laptops open, notebooks out. Richard Cole sat at the head of it the way he always did, jacket on, posture straight, reading glasses that he only wore in meetings perched on the edge of his nose. He looked, as always, completely unreachable. Penelope sat 3 seats down on the left side, close enough to be visible, far enough to be appropriate. She had thought about that too. The meeting moved through its agenda: quarterly projections, a new client onboarding, a staffing reshuffle on the 3rd floor that nobody pretended not to care about. Cole spoke precisely and sparingly, the way powerful men did when they had learned that saying less made people listen harder. When he asked questions, the room answered quickly. When he made a decision, nobody pushed back. Penelope contributed twice, both times sharp and well-timed. She watched Cole's pen pause on his notepad the second time she spoke, just for a beat before he continued writing. He didn't look up, but the pause was there. She noted it. After the meeting ended and people filtered out, Cole stayed behind to speak with the finance lead about something. Penelope was the last to leave on her side of the table, taking her time gathering her things at a pace that could not be called deliberate by any reasonable measure. As she reached the door, she heard him say her name. Penelope. She turned. The finance lead was already gone. Cole was still seated, glasses off now, turning a pen slowly between his fingers. The point you made about the Meridian account. I want a written summary on my desk by end of day. Full breakdown. It wasn't a question. It was never a question with him. Of course, she said simply, and held his gaze for exactly 1 second longer than the moment required before walking out. In the hallway, she allowed herself the smallest smile. She delivered the summary at 4:55 p.m. She could have emailed it. She chose not to. His door was half open. She knocked twice on the frame and stepped in without waiting, because she had calculated that waiting made women look uncertain, and she was never uncertain, not in front of him. He was on a call but held up one finger without looking at her. Wait. She stood near the door and waited, the folder held loosely in one hand. The office smelled like cedar and something warmer underneath it, and she noticed for the first time that he had a single framed photo on his desk facing away from visitors. She assumed it was Diane. He wrapped up the call and finally looked at her fully. That was another thing she had noticed about Richard Cole: when he actually looked at you, he did it completely. No half attention, no divided focus. All of it landing on you at once. It was disarming in a way that she suspected he had no idea about. She crossed the room and placed the folder on his desk. He opened it immediately, scanning the top page. She stood and let him read, not filling the silence with unnecessary words the way most people did when they were nervous. She wasn't nervous. "This is thorough," he said after a moment without looking up. "You asked for a full breakdown." He turned to the second page. "You included projections for Q3. You would have asked for them eventually." He looked up then. A flicker of something crossed his face, not quite amusement, not quite irritation. Something that lived exactly between the two. "You seem very confident about what I would and wouldn't ask for." Penelope held his gaze. "I pay attention, Mr. Cole." The room held that sentence for a moment longer than it should have. He closed the folder and leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her in that complete, unhurried way of his. She didn't move, didn't shift her weight, didn't look away, didn't soften her expression into something more palatable. She simply stood there and let him look, which she knew was its own kind of move. "Good work," he said finally, his voice giving nothing away. "That'll be all." Penelope nodded once, turned, and walked to the door. Her hand was on the frame when she paused, not long, just a breath, and said without turning around, "Good night, Mr. Cole." She was gone before he could respond. Back at her desk, gathering her things to leave, Darius rolled his chair over and dropped his voice to a conspiratorial murmur. "You know people talk about you too, right?" Penelope slung her bag over her shoulder. "People talk about everything, Darius." "I'm just saying." He shrugged with the grin of a man who found other people's tension entertaining. The way he looks at you in meetings. He looks at everyone in meetings. That's what managing directors do. Darius leaned back with a knowing look. Not like that. Penelope said nothing. She patted him twice on the shoulder the way you would a child who had said something amusing, and walked to the elevator. Inside, alone, as the doors slid shut, she looked at her own reflection in the polished metal and let the full weight of the day settle across her face for just a moment. Darius wasn't wrong. And Richard Cole, for all his composure and his tailored suits and his carefully maintained distance, had paused his pen for her today, had kept her standing in his office and studied her face like he was trying to solve something, had let the silence sit between them without rushing to fill it, which meant he was comfortable in it, which meant he had been sitting in it already, probably longer than he would ever admit. She pressed the lobby button and straightened up. Good, she thought. Let him sit in it a little longer. 3 weeks passed. 3 weeks of precisely calibrated professionalism. 3 weeks of Penelope delivering excellent work, contributing sharp ideas in meetings, and conducting herself with the kind of focused, unimpeachable competence that gave nobody, least of all Richard Cole, a single thing to point at. She had pulled back on the lingering glances, dialed down the charged silences, showed up, did her job brilliantly, and went home. It was, in its own way, the most aggressive thing she could have done. Because Penelope understood something that most women in her position either never learned or learned too late, that nothing unsettles a composed man quite like your sudden indifference. Attention, he could manage. Flirtation, he could deflect. But a woman who seemed to have quietly lost interest, that burrowed under the skin in a way that no amount of discipline could fully evict. She knew it was working because he had started finding reasons. Small ones, subtle enough that if she ever called them out he could laugh them off without breaking a sweat. A question about a report she had submitted that was thorough enough to require no questions. A comment during a team lunch directed specifically at her when there were 11 other people at the table. An email sent at 7:43 p.m. on a Wednesday asking her to lead a client presentation that, by every reasonable measure, should have gone to someone 3 levels above her. She had replied to that last one in 4 words. I'd be happy to. No exclamation mark. No enthusiasm. Just quiet, clean acceptance. She imagined him reading it and not being entirely sure how he felt about the response, and the thought had made her sleep very well that night. The client presentation was for a company called Vantage, a sleek, fast-growing logistics firm looking to restructure their internal communication strategy. Big account. The kind that got people promoted or quietly moved sideways depending on how it went. Cole had assigned Penelope to lead it with a supporting team of 3, which had raised exactly the eyebrows she expected it to raise. She heard the whispers, of course. She always did. Why her? Someone had muttered. She suspected it was Carla from the 3rd floor, who had been angling for high-profile accounts since before Penelope arrived and had the permanent expression of a woman counting other people's blessings. She didn't take the bait, she simply prepared. For 2 weeks she worked on the Vantage pitch with a focus that bordered on obsessive, staying late, arriving early, pulling data and restructuring it, until the presentation was not just good but undeniable. Her team, a quiet analyst named Jerome, a nervously enthusiastic junior named Priya, and a designer called Marcus who communicated almost entirely in nods, rose to match her energy. By the time the morning of the presentation arrived, they were ready. What she hadn't fully anticipated was that Richard Cole would be in the room. He was seated at the far end of the conference table when she walked in, along with 2 Vantage executives and Harlow's head of business development. He hadn't mentioned he would be attending. She found out from Brenda 40 minutes before it started, which was, she was almost certain, not an accident. She absorbed the information without reacting, adjusted nothing about her preparation, and walked into that room like she had known he would be there all along. Because even if she hadn't known, she had always been ready. She presented for 40 minutes. Clean, commanding, not a single stumble. She knew the material so deeply that she barely glanced at the slides, keeping her attention on the Vantage executives, reading them in real time, adjusting her tone and emphasis the way a skilled musician adjusts to the acoustics of a new room. Jerome handled the data breakdown flawlessly. Priya surprised everyone, including herself. Marcus had built slides so clean they looked like art. At several points during the presentation, Penelope felt Cole's eyes on her. Not the professional, evaluating gaze of a manager assessing his team. Something slower than that. Something that stayed a beat past where it should have stopped. She didn't look at him once during the entire 40 minutes. Not once. The Vantage executives were visibly impressed. There was a handshake energy in the room before anyone had formally agreed to anything, which was the best possible sign. After the presentation wrapped and pleasantries were exchanged, the clients were led to a separate room for a follow-up with the business development head, and Penelope's team quietly celebrated in the hallway with the restrained excitement of people who knew better than to pop champagne before the ink dried. She sent them ahead and stayed behind to collect the materials from the conference table. She had known he would linger. She had counted on it. Penelope. She continued stacking folders without looking up. Mr. Cole. She heard him move from the far end of the table, unhurried footsteps on the hardwood, stopping somewhere closer than the conversation required. She straightened up then and turned to face him, folders in hand, expression pleasant and professional, and giving away absolutely nothing. He looked at her for a moment before speaking. That was one of the strongest client presentations this team has delivered in 2 years. Jerome and Priya did excellent work. They followed your lead. He said it like a correction. There's a difference. She held his gaze and said nothing, which she had found over weeks of observation was the response that cost him the most composure. He seemed to recognize it too, because something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression, a slight tension in the jaw, a breath drawn just a fraction slower than usual. He glanced briefly at the door, then back at her. I want you on the Vantage account full-time going forward, he said. I'll have Brenda formalize the reassignment. Of course. A pause. The room had that particular quality of silence that only exists when two people are both choosing their words very carefully. You didn't look at me once, he said. His voice was even, but there was something underneath it. Something she recognized as a man asking a question he hadn't meant to ask out loud. Penelope tilted her head slightly. I was focused on the clients. She let a half-beat pass. Isn't that what you'd expect? His jaw moved almost imperceptibly. Yes. Then we're aligned, she said pleasantly, and picked up the last of the folders. I'll wait for Brenda's email about the reassignment. She walked to the door, and this time she didn't pause at the frame, didn't offer a lingering goodbye or a look over her shoulder. She simply left, clean and unhesitating, and let the door fall softly shut behind her. In the elevator, she exhaled slowly through her nose. He had noticed that she hadn't looked at him, had held onto it through the entire post-presentation conversation, and then said it out loud, which meant it had been sitting with him the whole time, quietly eating at the edges of that famous composure. She rode down to the lobby floor, walked out into the sharp afternoon air, and bought herself a coffee from the cart on the corner, something she rarely did. She felt she had earned it. That evening at 9:17 p.m., her work phone lit up. An email from Richard Cole, no subject line, 3 sentences. Vantage confirmed, full contract, good work today. She read it twice. Then she set the phone face down on her kitchen counter and smiled at the ceiling. He had emailed her personally, after hours, with no subject line, to tell her something Brenda could have communicated in a standard team update tomorrow morning. There was no professional reason for that email. None at all. She walked into his office on a Tuesday evening and closed the door behind her. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the soft, deliberate click of a woman who had decided that Tuesday was the day. Cole looked up from his desk. The floor was empty. It was past 7 p.m., and the last of the stragglers had cleared out 20 minutes ago. Just the two of them, the low amber of his desk lamp, and every unspoken thing that had been accumulating between them for months like weather building before a storm. "You forgot to sign off on the Vantage Amendment," she said, crossing the room and placing a single sheet of paper on his desk. He looked at the paper, then he looked at her, then slowly back at the paper. "I signed this morning," he said. "I know," Penelope replied. The silence that followed was the loudest thing that had ever happened in that office. Cole leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since she had known him, he didn't reach for the professional distance he kept holstered like a weapon. He just looked at her, long and unhurried and completely unguarded in a way that she had never seen on his face before, and it struck her somewhere deep that he was more devastating like this, unarmored, than he had ever been in a tailored suit running a boardroom. Penelope, her name in his mouth said like that, with no instruction attached to it, was its own kind of answer. She held his gaze and took one step closer to the desk, just one, slow and certain. "I bet I can make you tap out," she said quietly. It landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. She watched the ripple move across his face, the flash of something raw, immediately reined in, and then that jaw, that infuriating composed jaw, tightening against whatever was rising underneath it. He stood up, which she had not expected. He was taller than the desk made him seem, and the lamp threw his shadow long across the floor as he came around the side and stopped in front of her. Close, closer than he had ever allowed himself to stand. She could see the exact moment his carefully maintained restraint was costing him something real. "You need to think very carefully," he said, his voice low and controlled and fraying at the edges in a way only she was close enough to hear, "about what you're doing." Penelope looked up at him and said nothing. She didn't need to. Her eyes said everything she had been too precise and too patient to say out loud for the last several months, and she watched him read every word of it. His hand moved just slightly, just barely toward her, and then stopped, like a man who had caught himself at the edge of something and was using every resource he had left not to step off it. "I'm married," he said. "I know," she said softly. "Then you know this doesn't," he stopped, exhaled, started again. "This can't go anywhere." "I didn't ask it to." Something broke open behind his eyes. Not loudly. Richard Cole didn't do anything loudly. But she saw it, the fracture line running clean through the middle of all that composure, and the tremendous effort it was taking him to hold the two halves together. His jaw tightened. His hands, she noticed, had closed into loose fists at his sides. "Say something," she said quietly, "or don't, but stop pretending you don't feel this." The silence stretched out between them, taut and breathing. And then Richard Cole, managing director, 7 years married, the most composed man she had ever stood in front of, closed his eyes briefly, just briefly. And when he opened them again, whatever answer lived there was written so plainly across his face that neither of them needed to say a single word more. He had tapped out. Not with his hands, not with his words, but in the only way that actually counted, completely, and without any performance of resistance left. "This was a mistake," he said, but he didn't move away. Penelope picked up the unsigned paper from his desk, folded it once, and tucked it into her jacket. "Good night, Mr. Cole," she said, and walked out. She came back on Thursday. Not because she needed to, because she wanted to, and Penelope had long since stopped pretending otherwise, at least to herself. It was 8 p.m. this time, later than Tuesday. She had chosen that deliberately, the way she chose everything. The building was completely empty now, just the night security guard on the ground floor who had long stopped questioning why she stayed late, and the soft hum of the elevator carrying her up to a floor that had no business being visited at this hour. His light was on. It was always on. She didn't knock this time. She pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside, and the look on his face when he saw her told her everything she needed to know about how the last 48 hours had treated him. He looked like a man who hadn't slept properly since Tuesday, like a man who had sat in this exact chair and had the same argument with himself over and over and kept losing it. Good, she thought. She was wearing the black dress. She hadn't decided to wear it until she was already standing in front of her wardrobe that evening, and then her hand had gone to it without any real deliberation, because some decisions make themselves. It fit her the way expensive things do, like it had been constructed specifically around the idea of her, skimming every curve with a kind of elegant precision that made looking away from her a conscious act of will. Cole looked away from her, which told her more than looking would have. "You're here late," he said. His voice was steady. She had to give him that. The man had extraordinary discipline even when it was clearly costing him. "So are you," she replied, and moved into the room. She didn't go to his desk this time. Instead, she went to the window, his window, the wide one that looked out over the city lights, and stood with her back to him, looking out. She felt his eyes on her the moment she turned away, felt them move across her shoulders, down the line of her back, with the slow, helpless attention of a man who had been starving himself and had just been placed in front of a meal. She let him look. "We should talk about Tuesday," he said. "Should we?" She turned her head just slightly, not enough to fully face him, just enough that he could see the edge of her profile. "What would you like to say about it?" Silence. She turned around fully then and leaned back against the window ledge, arms loose at her sides, and looked at him across the room. He was standing now. She hadn't heard him get up, but there he was on his feet, jacket off for the first time she had ever seen at the office, shirt sleeves rolled to the forearm, and something about that small domestic detail of rolled sleeves undid something quiet in her chest that she hadn't expected. He looked at her like she was a problem he had run out of solutions for. Penelope. The way he said her name that night, low and strained and threaded through with something barely leashed, she felt it move through her like a current. "Richard," she replied. His first name. She had never used it before, not once in 2 years. She watched it hit him. He crossed the room. Not slowly this time, not with the measured, deliberate steps of a man in control of himself. He crossed it with the energy of someone who had made a decision and was living with the consequences of it in real time. He stopped in front of her, close, closer than Tuesday, the kind of close that has a temperature to it, and looked down at her with an expression that was equal parts want and torment. His hand came up and for a moment just hovered near her face, not touching, like he was giving himself one last chance to pull back. She tilted her face up toward him, just slightly, just enough. His fingers touched her jaw. Barely. The lightest contact, just his fingertips tracing the line of her face with an agonizing, deliberate slowness that suggested a man who had been thinking about this exact moment for a very long time and was refusing to rush it now that it was finally here. Her breath shifted. "Tell me to stop," he said. His voice was rough at the edges in a way she had never heard from him. All that composure finally worn down to something real underneath. "You know I won't," she said softly. His jaw tightened. His thumb traced slowly across her lower lip, and she felt her pulse spike hard against her throat, her fingers finding the fabric of his shirt without her consciously deciding to reach for it. "This is a terrible idea," he breathed. His forehead dropped to hers, eyes closed. The warmth of him this close was overwhelming in the best way, the cedar scent of him filling the small space between them completely. "Probably," she agreed quietly. He made a sound low in his throat, something between a laugh and surrender, and then his mouth found hers, and Richard Cole, for the first time in as long as either of them could remember, stopped thinking entirely. And Penelope, for all her calculation, For all her precision and patience and carefully constructed strategy, felt every single plan she had ever made dissolve completely the moment he kissed her deeply, and with the focused intensity of a man who did absolutely nothing halfway. She had wanted to make him tap out. She just hadn't counted on tapping out herself. She didn't go to him on Friday or Saturday. She spent the weekend in her apartment with a glass of wine she barely touched and the particular kind of restlessness that lives in the body rather than the mind. She moved from room to room without purpose, picked up her phone and set it back down, stood at her own window looking at her own city lights and thought about his hands. Specifically his hands. The way they had moved across her face like he was memorizing something. The way his thumb had traced her lip with that unbearable, deliberate slowness. The way he had held her jaw like she was something worth being careful with, which was not at all what she had expected from a man she had spent months believing she had completely figured out. That was the part that unsettled her. She had gone into that office with a plan. She had executed it with characteristic precision. And somewhere between his forehead dropping to hers and the moment his mouth finally met hers, the plan had simply ceased to exist, replaced by something far less structured and considerably more inconvenient. Feelings, she thought grimly, staring at her ceiling at 1 a.m. on Saturday night. Actual feelings. How profoundly unhelpful. Monday arrived with the particular cruelty of Monday mornings. Indifferent. Relentless. Requiring her to put on a dress and walk into a building, and sit 30 feet from a man whose mouth she could still feel against hers, if she let herself think about it for more than 3 consecutive seconds. She did not let herself think about it. She was at her desk by 8:47, coffee in hand, expression perfectly arranged. Jerome stopped by to talk through a Vantage update. Priya asked about a deadline. Darius said something about football. The ordinary machinery of the day began turning around her, and she fed herself into it gratefully, letting the routine press the weekend flat. She did not look at his office. Not at 9 a.m. Not at 10. Not when she walked past it on the way to the printer and felt the specific gravitational pull of a space she was actively choosing not to acknowledge. At 11:23, her email pinged. From Arcole. Subject: Vantage Strategy Update. My office, 2 p.m. 4 words. A subject line that gave nothing away. Completely professional in every measurable sense. She read it 3 times. Then she typed, confirmed, and hit send before she could compose anything more elaborate, because she was not going to be the woman who rewrote a 2-word email reply 11 times, even if a small and traitorous part of her very much wanted to be. She arrived at his office at exactly 2 p.m. He was on the phone when she knocked and entered. He looked up and something moved through his expression, quick and immediately contained, but there. He held up one finger. Wait. She sat in the chair across from his desk and crossed her legs and waited, the way she had before, except that everything about sitting in this office now carried the particular weight of Thursday evening pressed underneath it. He wrapped up the call and set the phone down. For a moment neither of them spoke. The room had that charged quality again, that thickness in the air that she had come to think of as the specific atmosphere that existed only between the two of them. "How was your weekend?" he asked. She looked at him. "You didn't call me in here to ask about my weekend." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "No," he agreed. He stood and came around the desk the way he had on Thursday, except slower this time, more measured, like a man who had spent the weekend in the same restless negotiation with himself that she had, and had arrived at a conclusion he wasn't entirely at peace with. He stopped in front of her chair and looked down at her, and she looked up at him, and the dynamic of it, her seated, him standing, the power of it shifting and blurring between them in ways that had nothing to do with job titles, sent a slow heat moving through her. "Thursday was," he began. "Don't," she said quietly. He paused. "Don't what?" Don't tell me it was a mistake. She held his gaze. We've already had that conversation and it didn't change anything. His jaw worked. He crouched down in front of her chair then, bringing himself to her level, which she hadn't expected, and the closeness of him. His face inches from hers, his forearms resting on the arms of her chair on either side of her like a cage she had no interest in escaping, pressed the air from her lungs in the most extraordinary way. I haven't stopped thinking about you, he said, low, direct, like it had been pulled out of him against his better judgment and he had decided to stop fighting the extraction. Her heart rate did something she refused to acknowledge. I know, she said softly. This is complicated. His eyes moved across her face with that slow, complete attention that she felt like a physical thing. I know that too. Penelope, her name again, that specific register. She was beginning to understand that he said her name like that when words were failing him, when the gap between what he wanted and what he was permitted was too narrow to navigate with language. She reached up slowly and straightened the collar of his shirt, a small, intimate gesture, the kind that belonged to people who had been together a long time, and the domesticity of it in this context made his breath catch audibly. Lock the door, she said softly. He looked at her for a long moment. The war behind his eyes was visible and genuine, and she did not take any pleasure in it the way she might have months ago when this was still a game, because it wasn't a game anymore. Somewhere along the way, somewhere between his thumb on her lip and one M on her ceiling, it had quietly become something else entirely. He stood. He walked to the door. And he locked it. When he turned back around, his expression had shifted into something she had not seen on his face before, unhurried and certain, and stripped entirely of the professional distance he had spent 2 years perfecting, and it was the most devastating thing she had ever seen on a man in her life. He crossed back to her slowly. She stood to meet him, and when his hands found her waist and pulled her in with a quiet, deliberate confidence that suggested he had been thinking about exactly this all weekend, she went without hesitation, her hands sliding up his chest, her face tilting up to his. "You're going to be the end of me," he murmured against her mouth. "Probably," she whispered back. And then neither of them said anything at all for a very long time. She was still in his arms when his office phone rang. Neither of them moved at first. The sound cut through the silence like something deliberate, something sent specifically to remind them both where they were and what they had just done, and what it meant. His chin was resting against her temple, one hand still warm at the small of her back, and she could feel his heartbeat gradually returning to something that resembled normal against her cheek. The phone rang again. He pulled back first. Not abruptly. Richard Cole didn't do anything abruptly, but with the particular slowness of a man returning from somewhere far away. He looked at her face for a moment before he looked at the phone, and what she saw in his expression in that unguarded second was something she knew she would be turning over in her mind for a very long time. He straightened his shirt, picked up the receiver. "Cole." A pause. She watched his face change. "Diane," his voice was even, practiced, the professional distance sliding back into place like a mask he had worn so long it still fit perfectly. "Yes, I'm on my way." He hung up. The room recalibrated around that single name. Diane. 4 letters that rearranged every molecule of air between them and reminded Penelope with quiet, precise brutality exactly what this was and exactly what it was. She reached for her jacket from the back of the chair without being asked. No dramatics, no wounded expression. She was not that woman and she refused to become her now. "Penelope," he started. "You should go," she said simply. He looked at her with an expression that contained too many things to name: guilt and want and conflict, and something that looked dangerously close to something she wasn't ready to put a word to. He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "I need you to know that I—" His phone buzzed, a text this time. He glanced down at it involuntarily and she watched the flicker of something cross his face. Not just guilt, something else. Something that tightened his jaw and drained a fraction of color from his face in a way that had nothing to do with her. She frowned slightly. "Richard, what is it?" He looked up from the phone and met her eyes, and for the first time since she had known him, through boardroom pressure and client crises and every charged moment between them, Richard Cole looked genuinely shaken. "I have to go," he said. His voice had changed entirely. "You already said that." "No." He grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair and his keys from the desk in one fluid motion. "Penelope, I have to go." Something about the way he said it the second time made her stomach drop. She caught his arm as he passed her. "Hey, look at me." He did. "What's in that message?" He hesitated for 3 full seconds, which from a man like Richard Cole was the equivalent of a full breakdown, and then he said 4 words that stopped her blood completely. "Diane knows about us." The air left the room. She released his arm. He held her gaze for one more moment, something desperate and unfinished living in his eyes, and then he was gone, door open, footsteps fast down the empty corridor, the elevator chiming distantly, and then nothing. Silence. Penelope stood in the middle of his office completely alone, the city lights burning indifferently outside the window, her jacket in her hands, her heart doing something she had specifically instructed it not to do. She looked down at the desk, at the phone he had left face up in his rush. The screen was still lit. And what she saw on it, the full message, the name it was sent from, the 3 lines of text that Diane Cole had apparently typed at 6:48 p.m. on a Monday evening, made Penelope's blood run cold. Because it wasn't what she expected. It wasn't anger. It wasn't accusation. It wasn't the message of a wife who had found out and was waiting at home ready for war. It was something far more complicated than that. And it changed everything. If you made it to the end, you already know this is not a simple story anymore. Like this video, subscribe and turn on notifications right now because part 2 is coming and I promise you are not ready for what Diane's message actually said. Drop your theories in the comments. What do you think was in that text? Do you think Penelope went too far? And the real question, who do you actually feel sorry for? Because after this part, the answer might surprise you. See you in the next one.